Ukraine is not just a war between Russia and NATO. Now, Russia has been saying for now weeks upon weeks that it is fighting NATO. It's fighting the West in Ukraine. It's not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and the West. Sergei Shoigu, right, the defense minister, he's been saying it, right? That's true. But Ukraine is not just a war between Russia and the West. It is the United States' war on the world. And in particular, it is all about, right, Russia, right, Moscow, the road to Moscow through Ukraine is also the pathway to Beijing, to China. The United States sees Ukraine as a really good opportunity to test out the final confrontation. It sees the end game, so to speak. It sees Taiwan as a potential flashpoint for a confrontation between the two countries, but it sees the whole Asia Pacific as that potential flashpoint as well. It just so happens that Taiwan is geographically a very convenient to wage some kind of military operation. Now, of course, there are many problems with this that we could probably spend a lot of time talking about. But I think what's important to note is that the overall agenda here, and the overall agenda is that the United States sees Ukraine as a testing ground for a future conflict with China because Russia holds similar geopolitical implications for the United States, but China is the big prize. The Chinese market, the destabilization of China's economic influence, the ability to control the Asia Pacific, and in turn also the African continent, possibly even Latin America. A lot of that goes through China now because China is all of these countries' biggest trading partner. It actually is providing a counterweight and alternative to U.S. dominated international financial institutions through its lending practices. It's building infrastructure in the African continent in ways that the U.S. and the West never have, never will. So in all of these ways, China represents this real threat, not just the China threat, which is all about Cold War propaganda and jingoism and racism, but the real threat is actually that the United States' empire is in decline and China will be stepping in not as a replacement, but as an alternative. That's really what is at heart here with the US's obsession with trying to build up a conflict toward China. So Ukraine is all about building up to China, building up to a larger war with China. And guess what? Former US officials have been saying as much. You've heard over and over and over again, all the same Beltway think tanks that I've cited here, all those neocon propagandists, both political parties have been saying, well, Ukraine is like Taiwan, and eventually we're going to be dealing with the same situation in Taiwan. They've been saying it out of the side of their mouth without really attaching the significance, without really saying, well, this is a proxy war. This is about regime change against Russia and regime change against China. They haven't said that outright, but now U.S. officials or former U.S. officials are saying this. So here you have Oliver North, Mr. Iran-Contra. So, just a quick rundown of Iran-Contra. So that scandal, which occurred during the Reagan administration, what was going on is that the CIA and the United States' political apparatus, they were facilitating dirty wars, like Max Blumenthal is saying here. This is Max Blumenthal's tweet. He's saying that Reagan's dirty wars in Central America, Africa, and Afghanistan are akin to Ukraine. And that, I believe, is true. But Iran-Contra was all about, you had sanctions on Iran after the Iranian Revolution 79. But you also had the Iran-Iraq war happening. You had also these dirty wars in Central America, the Contras fighting in places like Nicaragua, El Salvador. Guatemala. You had Central America on fire, right, with the Contras. And the United States needed to find a way to arm Iran and supply the Contras. And what they decided to do was to secretly funnel arms to Iran and then get those weapons to the Contras in exchange. Some people say for cocaine, some people say for drugs. But nonetheless, this was all about trying to create new modes of arms transfers to the Contras to ensure that these wars continue, because there was a lot of opposition to this, right? There was domestic opposition in the U.S. There was also some unfortunate diplomatic losses that the United States was taking on the open front. So covertly, the United States committed just outright corruption and ended up with this scandal. So Oliver North was the fall guy. He was definitely one of the I wouldn't call him an architect, but he was certainly moving through this process. And he was in the American administration. He was in the national security staff. He was an advisor. And so he was tasked with facilitating this process. But here you have Oliver North basically going on Fox News and he admits what I've been saying here, that this is all, Ukraine is all about paving the way to a war with China. Here's what he had to say.
Is that money well spent? The president's assuring us that he's going to deal with it responsibly, but $110 billion, American people aren't seeing that kind of money. It's coming out of their pockets.
Well, it's coming out of all of our pockets, but it's money well spent. In my humble opinion, this is very much like what Ronald Reagan did back in the 80s. And I do have some experience with that. I know that makes me a lot older than most of our viewers, but in fact, he believed in supporting freedom fighters. He did it in Latin America. He did it in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique. He did it in Afghanistan. Those people were willing, as the Ukrainian people are, to use their blood and our bullets. And by the way, most of that 110 billion total,
they are willing, the Ukrainian people, just like the African insurgencies that they funded, that the CIA funded, just like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan that the CIA funded, just like the Contras, which the CIA funded. Ukrainians are willing to spill their blood with our bullets. He's literally saying this. This just goes to show how the foreign policy establishment actually thinks about Ukraine. Not some kind of democracy. It's some kind of heroic effort to undermine Russia, to defeat Russia. It is actually all about weapons. It's all about fueling dirty wars. But let's continue.
Between the 45, the 1.7, and the previous 65, over 110 billion, is spent here in the United States. It's provided to contractors and defense logisticians and the kinds of people who build the kinds of systems that we're getting. So most of that money is spent here in America. Good, hardworking Americans have the jobs. And when you look at that kind of an investment, what would be the difference if, when the giant does awake, and that's all about communist China, it's just not a plug for this book. The idea of it is to make sure that they get the right message and to make sure that Putin gets the right message. No more invasions. And that means the people in Taiwan are going to need the same kinds of weapon systems that we're now providing to the Ukrainians.
So there you have it. They need the same kind of weapons. Okay. That's what they're saying here. That's what Oliver North is saying here, is that everything that's happening in Ukraine is justified. All these weapons transfers, it's not only good for jobs in America, but it's great for the world because Ukraine needs all of these weapons to defeat Russia. So a message is sent to China. The sleeping giant of communist China needs to understand that what's happening to Ukraine could happen to China. That is the out-and-out message of Oliver North, Iran-Contra scandal extraordinaire, this outright neocon criminal who nearly brought the world to the brink as a cold warrior, trying to threaten and encircle and basically kill whoever and whatever arose, whatever movements arose against U.S. empire at the time of the Cold War. Now he's saying in this new Cold War moment that it is time to show China that Ukraine is actually all about leading up to a war with China, with the CPC, with the Chinese government. So they're just telling us right to our faces what the reality is, essentially. Oliver North, right? That you can trust him on these issues, on this question, because he is simply a mouthpiece. He is someone who has a lot of experience in this regard, in proxy wars. This is what he spent much of his political career helping to facilitate. And so there you have it. China is next. This is something that has been in the making for many years. When Russia and China were being encircled at the same time in a very similar way, just different institutions, different countries, different parts of the world. Nonetheless, when you had NATO's buildup along Russia's border happening at the same time that the United States was basically shifting nearly everything it had to the Asia Pacific, a lot of people didn't get it. A lot of people didn't understand that there was a purpose to this, that it wasn't just what the neocons and what the war propagandists and what the corporate media was telling us, that there was a real purpose behind it, that the purpose was that these two countries were next, and that it didn't really matter which order it went, but that many strategists, many of these imperial think tankers, what they understood was, and you heard it from John Mearsheimer here on this channel when I covered his thoughts about Taiwan and China, a lot of them understand that China is strong, economically especially, and that it is very difficult to undermine China in the same way that it thought it could Russia. Now, it underestimated Russia, I believe. I believe that the U.S. imperial deep state, its apparatus, it underestimated Russia. It thought, well, Russia's weaker. Russia's still coming out of the Soviet Union's collapse. It still has a lot of contradictions. It has a lot of internal issues. It has a lot of things we can exploit. It's not as big economically, right? It's still really kind of a neo-colony in a lot of ways, economically, not necessarily politically. But in terms of its economic size, there is a lot of ways. If sanctions like what was put onto Russia during this Ukraine crisis, during this proxy war led by the NATO, if those sanctions were slapped onto Russia, Russia would collapse, and then we can get to China. I mean, NATO literally said as much during its summit in June of 2022. It said, hey, China's a malicious actor, and we need to get more involved there as well in that region to stop China. And that was NATO vocalizing and voicing the agenda. And the agenda is, yes, Russia needs to be overthrown, needs to be regime changed, and so does China. And it's just a matter of how. And so Oliver North says, well, right on Sean Hannity's program, right on Fox News says, well, here's how. You keep pumping weapons into Ukraine. You defeat Russia, which is a pipe dream, by the way. Defeat Russia and then show China, the sleeping giant, communist China, show China that it's next, that Taiwan now needs to receive the same amount of money for arms. The New York Times argued this. It's not just Oliver North. It's not just Fox News. The New York Times I showed on this channel was arguing the same thing. Turn Taiwan into a porcupine against China. Start to funnel the same kind of weapons. In the new National Defense Authorization Act, there's lots of money earmarked for more weapons transfers to Taiwan, including backlogs of somewhere a little under $20 billion. But they said, again in the New York Times, this is multiple times the New York Times saying, well, it's hard to arm Taiwan. It doesn't have the same capabilities as Ukraine does. It doesn't have NATO countries surrounding it. It doesn't have the same kind of advantages. But we need to step it up. We need to prepare Taiwan. Again, another pipe dream. Taiwan never will militarily be able to confront the mainland. And honestly, the people who live in Taiwan, which is Chinese territory under international law, under 3 joint communiques between the US and China, as well as many agreements with most countries in the world, 90+% of them. It's just a different situation. But nonetheless, the U.S. continues to pump weapons into forces in Taiwan that are friendly towards separatism and independence and have bought into the China scaremongering, have been bribed into it, have been benefiting from it. And that's the strategy. The strategy is to try to fortify Taiwan so it can be a launching pad for a war with China. And Ukraine is a testing ground for that as well. The imperialists, the hegemonists, the Western empire does not think in terms of one country or another country. It thinks about the world. It thinks about domination in domination terms. It thinks about how it can control not just Ukraine, not just Russia, not just China, but everywhere. It wants to be the sole superpower so that it can have all of the advantages that come with that, including being able to park its flailing monopoly corporate capitalist economy onto the throats to plunder the people, to sit on their throats, to rob them of everything they have, and to have the political control to be able to do that. That's really what is at stake here. And China and Russia present the two biggest impediments to that. And it's not just because China and Russia stand alone in this. It's because China and Russia diplomatically, politically, economically, militarily have very strong relations with most of the world, especially the global south, and that relationship is going to only strengthen. You saw African countries reject sanctions on Russia. You've seen African countries reject decoupling from China, maximizing and increasing its trade partnerships, its economic partnerships with China. You see the same in Latin America, in the Caribbean. You see Cuba, you see Syria, you see all these countries, 140 plus, join the Belt and Road Initiative. You see the strengthening of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of the BRICS Plus mechanism. You just see over and over again, even countries like Saudi Arabia, like Bahrain, like the Gulf Cooperation Council. You see all of these countries in what used to be hostile, basically pro-U.S. imperial territory, suddenly come to their senses and say, it's time to balance out our political and economic relationships. And that means getting closer with Russia and China. And the U.S. is actually the one becoming more and more isolated. So in order to stop that isolation, the United States, through mouthpieces like Oliver North going on Fox News, this is the line. And the line is that, and this is the line among the neocons, that Ukraine is not just a war between NATO and Russia. It is a war that is meant to lead into a broader conflict with China. We have to understand that, and we have to thus understand both, because this is a big blind spot for many. Big blind spot. There's a lot of people who believe that the U.S. media, the Western media, is lying about Russia, and understand that there is an operation going on against Russia when it comes to Ukraine, that there's a broader imperial agenda. But with China, it's a lot harder, because the Cold War propaganda has arguably been even stronger, in that China, being a socialist identifying country, a country that's led by a communist party, has a lot more baggage for people in the West to overcome. There's a lot more baggage to overcome than with Russia, which, unfortunately, the Western mentality often is the weaker the country is, the better it is for people to support. That's why you have people who support Palestine, for example, but who won't speak out for Syria, because Syria pushed back the empire, and Palestine has yet to be able to do so successfully in a while, right? Palestinians find themselves in a much more marginal position than, let's say, the Syrian government, right? Palestinian people are still fighting for a state itself, to be able to have that kind of self-determination and sovereignty, which Syria supports, by the way. But what I'm saying here is that people in the West, even those who are well-meaning, who even oppose the U.S.'s proxy war on Russia through Ukraine, often don't get the China connection, and often don't understand that these two countries are aligned, Russia and China, in many ways, and they are being provoked and attacked by the same empire, and that it's happening simultaneously, and that we can't choose one over the other. That is a fool's game, and that is one that will do nothing for the cause of peace. So listen to Oliver North. Listen to what he has to say, because that is a true education in the empire. That is a true that is what it means for the establishment, for the blob, as Mark Sloboda has called it, with the foreign policy blob basically saying out loud what it's always thinking, which is, how do we undermine China? How can Ukraine, this proxy war in Ukraine, undermine China? And the way that they see it is that if they can get victories in Ukraine against Russia, if they can bring Russia down, again, a fantasy, but if they can do it, then they can do it against China.